Hello and welcome to this IEA discussion video about the Conservative Party leadership race. With the resignation of Boris Johnson as Conservative Party and UK Prime Minister, there is a race afoot to choose the next leader of the Conservative Party who will immediately go into office as Prime Minister. Just to give you a very brief overview of the race for people who aren't from the UK and haven't been fixed to your television screens for the last 2 weeks. The race is, the rules of the race are that first Conservative Party members of Parliament narrow down all of the runners and riders, currently 5, down to the top 2. Those 2 go out to a ballot of the membership, something similar to a closed primary in the United States. And then the person who gets the most votes from that race becomes the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So while others, though, are focusing on the horse race to the detriment of pretty much everything else, we at the IEA focus on the big issues, the things that really, really matter. So we are going to talk today about the policies, not the politics. And I'm delighted to be joined by 2 fantastic IEA members of staff, both of whom have seen their work rates increase massively since Boris Johnson announced that he was leaving 10 Downing Street. Our Head of Public Policy, Matthew Lesh, and our Head of Public Affairs, Ed Hughes. Welcome both.
Thank you.
Hello.
So I wanted to kick off by almost asking, where are we now, rather than what the next Prime Minister might do when he or she gets into office. Where has Boris Johnson left us? I mean, leaving aside any and all of personal issues, moral issues that people may have, policy-wise, is the United Kingdom a freer place than when he came to power?
I mean, quite simply, I think the answer to that is he's left the UK in a pretty stagnant position in a lot of respects in terms of Boris's agenda. He was trying in the final moments as Rome fell to announce a bunch of quite good supply side policies. We never quite got around to that. Instead, what we had was quite a lackluster process. Now, of course, some of that is the fault of COVID, and his ability to implement policies and changes was limited as he lost authority as leader. But it felt like quite often what Boris was doing was a version of Toryism that was big state, big intervention, paternalistic, and controlling. Very much not the kind of conservatism that he'd expressed previously in the Daily Telegraph or when he was on the backbenches or in various speeches. So in that sense, I think Boris has left us in a disappointing position. The economy has obviously been damaged by COVID. It's got headwinds that come from the war with Ukraine and the cost of energy, and those are huge danger points. You add on top of that the fact that we're going to see over the coming months expected, again, huge increases in the cost of energy. It's going to be a tough period, no matter who becomes leader of the Tory party. Much is, in fact, going to be out of their control in terms of the overall economic position. And I think, therefore, what we're going to see is quite a kind of concerning status quo. Now, I don't think we've heard that much of that in the leadership debate so far. You don't get a sense that we're on the cusp of quite a totemic moment and quite a dangerous moment when it comes to the economy. But hopefully that'll change over the coming weeks, and we'll get more of a sense of where they stand.
Yeah, Ed, do you feel that it feels a bit to me that at this stage of the competition, and we're not going to talk about the politics of it, but that in this stage of the leadership race, nobody particularly wants to talk about the shortcomings of the previous government very much, because they don't want to upset the supporters of Boris Johnson and his government. How do you think that we can, as free marketeers, break through that unwillingness to talk about the problems of the current government for political purposes? How can we break through that and really get to a discussion about how free markets could make the UK a better place?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of interesting, and Matt kind of touched on this, in that, Boris was meant to be a sort of break from one nation conservatism, and has actually ended up being probably the most one nation conservative, has led the most one nation conservative government that we've seen, certainly since the major government. So I just really think it's sort of restating what the alternative within the Conservative Party is to that line of thinking, which is greater freedom and let a smaller role for the state. And I think a lot of candidates are sort of putting their stall out, in that way. There are some people who are perhaps trying to court the Boris loyalists and whatever, and are sort of sort of going along with sort of more the one nation line, but a lot of the candidates are sort of actively placing themselves against that. So I certainly think that there is a sort of political appetite for it.
Mm. Matthew, I wanted to just go back to one point that you mentioned before that I found quite interesting in retrospect. You were sort of saying that, as it seemed to me, that as Boris Johnson was desperately trying to cling on and save his job, that his response, the solution, was to try and bring in a package of free market supply side reforms. So firstly, why do you think he waited so long to do it? And secondly, if that's what he thought would save his job, why are not all the candidates taking those reforms and taking them even further? You're on mute, Matt.
Look, I think Boris's time as prime minister was incoherent. And he kind of jumped around between all sorts of different approaches. I mean, we saw that during COVID. We saw that last year when he was making his speech about how higher wages would mean a higher productivity economy and everyone would be better off. Now, that didn't eventuate. With a big focus around limiting immigration as well from Boris at the time. In the end, we just got masses of inflation and lower quality of life. I think eventually he realized he'd kind of run to an end in his ability to tax and spend. Rishi obviously wasn't really letting him cut taxes in the way he wanted to, so he needed an alternative approach. Well, the only alternative approach was supply side reform to try to grow the economy and create a greater sense of prosperity. I mean, he gave a speech in early June, which feels like a lifetime ago, where actually he basically put forward all the right ideas and notions. I think the speech was focused on housing. The actual policy that he followed up there on housing wasn't that impressive. It wasn't that supply side reform that his rhetoric had suggested. So why did he choose that approach? Well, I think he kind of realized in the end that he had effectively two issues. One issue was all the scandals, which had really hurt him in the public and made him extremely unpopular. And then he realized he'd lost a lot of his underlying base in Parliament, a lot of his kind of ERG supporters, a lot of his free market leaning Tory MPs because of the way he'd been running his government. So when those two things came to an head, he realized he needed to take a change in approach. Now, why he didn't do that earlier will be one for the history books. I think he had this very long period where he thought he could basically have his cake and eat it too. He could spend his way into prosperity. He could just spend lots of money on leveling up, and that would somehow achieve positive economic outcomes for the country. Now, that hasn't really worked as a policy approach. So do we expect Tory MPs to then take that approach now? Well, we actually do. We actually are seeing, I think, a pretty strong consensus across Tory MPs running in this race that supply side reforms are necessary. Penny Mordaunt's talked about it. Liz Truss has talked about it. Rishi's pointed to the need for economic reform. It seems like there's a general consensus on that side of things. There's probably less consensus when it comes to tax and spend. Obviously, I think all the leadership contenders say they'd like to see tax cuts at some point. There's differences on whether or not that should be funded by in the future somehow, or whether that should be funded today by increasing debt. That's probably the major policy difference we've seen in the leadership campaign so far, best that I can tell.
Ed, just before we move on to the ins and outs of the policies of the race, do you think that there's a chance for free marketeers to maybe undo some of the worst? So, I mean, current bills that are going through the House. So, for example, I know Kemi Badenoch's talked about saying the online safety bill is not fit for purpose in its current form. Do you think that and possibly other areas, the leadership race is an opportunity to undo or at least roll back some of the worst excesses of the Johnson government?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, basically, the government have quietly sort of pulled the online safety bill now until the new leader is announced. And so if there are sort of one or two viable candidates for the leadership who I think would, if not make major changes to it, and one has actually gone as far as to say so, would make major changes to it or scrap it entirely. So, yeah, I mean, I think the whole sort of parliamentary agenda set out in the Queen's speech is basically, up for contention now. I think there's sort of one or two candidates who are more likely to be a sort of continuity of Boris Johnson than others. But yes, I certainly think it's a real opportunity, for to sort of that person, to the new leader, to distance themselves from some of the more sort of sloppy legislation that we've seen recently.
So it seems like going to the race itself, that like you said, Matthew, the big issue has been not whether or not to cut taxes, but at what time and whether or not you pay for them in the short term or the long term. It seems that there's a lot of concerns around inflation, around making the government debt even greater than it already is. Where do you come down on that particular issue?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question and something I've tackled with myself, because philosophically, I don't like the idea of the government borrowing and putting burdens onto future generations and ending up hurting us. Ideally, I would like to see tax cuts funded by spending cuts. I'd like to see the role and scope and size of the government decrease, and accordingly be able to afford letting more people keep more money in their own pockets. That said, at this time, we're seeing a very historically high tax burden coming before us. In the coming years, we're going to see the tax the highest levels in 70 years as a proportion of the economy. The government's increased the income tax through national insurance, and as well as freezing the brackets. So inflation will mean that we're all paying more tax as our incomes go up. We've also seen, obviously, that the government increasing corporate tax quite substantially, jumping up in April next year. I think that's going to have a huge negative impact, and obviously only on the money in people's pockets, but also the investment incentives, especially when combined with something like the windfall tax. I think business is going to be quite worried that, well, if we do try to make decisions to create jobs, to boost productivity, to grow the economy, and the government's just going to end up taking a lot of that money away from us. And I think as a consequence of that, I would like to see them cut taxes in the shorter run, or at the very least reverse some of the tax increases that they've done and not pursue any further tax increases. And I think that can be achieved. And I think the idea of consoles has been talked about previously, this notion that rather than paying COVID debt off immediately or in the next 5 years, you actually say, you treat it like we've historically done with war debts and pay it off over a 50-year period, because it is a historical large jump in debt, and then use some of that additional headroom to borrow to not put up taxes in the short run, as well as in the medium term try to reduce government spending. I think that would be a smart approach. So I don't agree with Rishi's notion that we'll decrease taxes sometime in the future. I think what he's done is actually quite damaging, and the result of that will be a smaller economy and less revenue for the Treasury in the long run as well. So I don't think his method of increasing taxes will end up decreasing the debt substantially in any case, because we'll have a slow economy. So I would like to see tax cuts in the shorter run.
Yeah, it would be nice to see candidates at least mention the Laffer curve and where they think we sit on it. Because I mean, the idea that we can keep increasing taxes to higher and higher levels and continue to and say that maximizes government tax revenue is for the birds, and I think it's been disproven quite a number of times by this point. Ed, do you have any thoughts on this? What's your feeling of how the Conservative Party feels about taxes, Conservative members as well as MPs?
I think you Conservative members overwhelmingly are, desperate for tax cuts. Both for themselves, because of the sort of cost of living and the ever-increasing tax burden, and for the party. They've been in government for 12 years now as a party and have not really been able to, do anything meaningful to bring down the tax burden, to be honest. In terms of the parliamentary party, it's very much still, I think, the sort of, fiscal conservatism, reduced spending mentality. And we get all this sort of stuff about unfunded tax cuts and, et cetera, as if they literally have never heard of the Laffer curve. And, they're not even considering the possibility that we may have, fallen on the wrong side of it. So I agree with Mass and you. It would be very encouraging if they would look at that. But I don't really think it's the vibe at the moment.
Mm-hmm. That's sad to hear that. It's that there isn't a. So the big issue has been taxes. There doesn't seem to have been a huge amount of other discussions, or other major policy discussions. There's been a bit around, quote unquote, wokery. There's been, I think, Sajid Javid was the only MP only candidate who talked about housing, and then he went out very early on. But nobody else seems to have picked up that.
Well, I think Kemi has talked about reform of monetary policy and the sort of impact of cheap money on housing and the price of assets, which is, I don't think I've ever heard really a sort of frontline Conservative politician talk about that, and it's a major contributor to the cost of housing that we don't hear about much. I thought that was pretty encouraging, but no, you're right that Sajid was the only one who sort of, came out and said we need to build a lot of houses very quickly and make it easier to do so.
Yes. Why do you think that these other issues aren't getting much pickup? I mean, there are obviously very different views around what the government should do, what a Conservative government should do about housing within the party itself, and that it's such a big issue that is not only is not only going to make a fundamental difference to the people's cost of living over the next decade, but it's also one that is politically incredibly important for the Conservative Party. The idea that we're going to have almost a generation of young people who can't get on the housing ladder at all, or not until their late 30s, then where do the Conservative voters of the future come from? Why is this issue not front and centre in people's minds?
Yeah, I think this is quite an interesting challenge right across this campaign so far. Sajid was the only one who put out a kind of relatively detailed manifesto with his thoughts about a bunch of different issues that could be scrutinized. Now, notably, Sajid was also one of the first candidates to drop out and wasn't particularly successful. Now, that might be for its own reasons, but it is also indicative of the fact that MPs aren't that interested in detailed policy prescriptions. They're clearly not asking or demanding some kind of public statement of what the candidates stand on each issue. There was some media commentary I saw that Rishi, as the front runner, intended not really to put out much policy detail at all. And I think you've seen a kind of similar trend across a whole bunch of different candidates. Now, politically, I think that makes sense for them, because the more policy detail you put out, the more you leave yourself open to attack by your colleagues who disagree with you. You kind of, to some extent, particularly in this point, you want to be as much as you can, everything to everyone. At the same time, though, the lack of policy engagement, I think, is also going to hurt them. It's going to hurt them because one of these people is about to be prime minister. They've got a whole bunch of societal challenges, and what they're going to do about it is important and is essential. And it would be good to see more evidence of them having thought in more detail about what their policy responses would be, not just a vibe of what they happen to do when they get there, because they'll be distracted when they get there. There'll be an international crisis. There'll be a foreign leaders visit. There'll be meetings with the Queen. There'll be question time, PMQs on Wednesday. There's so many things day to day that distract you. And if you don't have an underlying policy agenda, you're going to struggle. And housing is a perfect example here, where there are divisions in the Tory party, and there is a lot of concern, a lot of quote unquote NIMBYism, people who don't want to see much reform, you don't want to see new houses be built. On the other hand, though, this is an existential issue potentially for the Tory party. If they fail to get people on the housing ladder, if they fail to show that there are opportunities for younger people to establish wealth and put down roots, you're going to have a societal long-term damage that will end up hurting them. And that heart of that contradiction, as well as all the economic costs of housing that you've just described so elegantly, Sam, is very key. And I hope as we get, particularly the final two, there is some pressure to put out policies and ideas and what they think is politically possible and capable, and that the Tory electorate does end up rewarding them for that fact, and that we don't just get distracted by very top level comments about things, and there's a bit more depth and a bit more thinking about what they stand for.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm with my tongue firmly stuck in my cheek. It's very depressing that you don't think that MPs care about or desire well thought out policies. You think they might?
Yeah, I mean, you would think they would, but I don't see any evidence so far of somebody coming out and saying, where's your policy detail? What do you stand for? What are you going to do on net zero? What are you going to do on health? Maybe these conversations happen privately. I don't know. Maybe when Penny Mordaunt calls you up for support and you say back to her, what do you think about housing? What do you think about the online safety bill, etc. And we saw Damien Collins, who's a big proponent of the online safety bill, just recently became the digital minister after his predecessor resigned, Chris Philp resigned, and he tweeted saying, "I'm going to support Penny Mordaunt because she supports the online safety bill." Now, that sounds like a commit. That sounds like a commitment that Penny has made to Damien Collins, because that's the issue Damien Collins cares about. I don't know whether or not that's really Penny's position. As far as I can see, she's never said anything particularly publicly about the issue. Obviously, maybe there are a bunch of commitments going on, but I would like to see that out in the public domain and able to scrutinize it. And certainly, it's going to have to be out in the public domain. And it's going to have to be scrutinized when it gets to the members, when it gets to those 100,000 people who might want a bit more of an idea about what they stand on issues. And the MPs also will be asked questions at hustings around the country by Tory party members, and they're going to have something to say on issues like that.
Yeah, it's sad in some ways that many of the more thoughtful, at least policy-wise, candidates have dropped out so early. I saw Suella Braverman had a very, very interesting piece on The Economist's, I think it was yesterday or at least this week, discussing, answering answering the question about what to do about the UK's productivity. And I mean, it was for however many words, 1,000 words, it was a very thoughtful piece. And I'm surprised that we haven't seen some of the other candidates publish something of a similar length on a particular issue, at least that lays out their broad strokes of what they're interested in. Ed, do you have any thoughts on the state of policy in the party at the moment?
Just sort of touching on something that Matt was saying earlier, that I think it's absolutely vital that they lay out their policy positions, because apart from anything, as Matt was saying, it's very easy to become distracted. And something like housing is going to be something that you have to drive through, right? It's not going to happen by accident. And we're sort of increasingly seeing that sort of governments are living and dying by the quality of the advice they're receiving. And so going into number 10, you need to know who you need and what sort of special advisors and similar sort of people are gonna drive forward that policy. And if you have no idea, which it looks like a lot of the candidates do not, it's just going to get completely lost, and it will be something that a problem, but a problem for the next government. So it's sorry to be depressing, but the fact that none of them are setting out their stall, firmly, I'm going to build X number of houses, and this is what I'm going to do to change planning, and etc., is concerning.
I mean, you would imagine that just from a party management view, this would be quite important, because if they're coming in, and this is how the system works, and I have no problem with it, but whoever comes in will be coming in without a mandate from the public. They will, without having put a manifesto to the country.
Well, they will have a mandate from the public, because the mandate is for the party and not the prime minister.
You're right.
I think you're technically right, Ed. I do agree. Obviously, that Britain has a parliamentary system, and I think it was a little bit, I wouldn't quite say Trumpite, but I would say a little bit desperate when Boris kept saying, I have a mandate for 14 million people, you can't remove me. Well, I mean, that's obviously not true.
He didn't have a mandate either, in the same way. The mandate is for the party.
Well, no, but I think there is some truth to the claim, not in formal constitutional terms, but in public perception. And I think there will be actually, even whether or not you thought Boris should go, there will be a lot of people who say, what the heck is going on here? I voted for this guy, because people do, I think, quite often these days vote with a presidential system, vote for a prime minister. They're voting for a local Tory, but in the knowledge that they think they're going to support Boris as prime minister. So I think that is going to be a challenge policy-wise, because if somebody, to some extent, whoever becomes the next leader still technically has to, is there to fulfill the manifesto that Boris put forward. Now, that manifesto was vague enough and broad enough to basically do whatever the heck you like, to some extent. But at some point, there will be questions about, if you want to do more radical change, you might rightfully and genuinely need to go to election, particularly if Tory MPs aren't supportive. And I think that an underlying issue here as well is a lot of the kind of reforms that would boost Britain's economy, would make us richer and more successful, are actually extremely difficult and will create opponents. There are veto actors, there are sectional interests who will say, no, I don't want to get rid of tariffs on food imports. There will be people who say, no, I don't think we need planning reform. I don't want to see any more houses be built. There will be people who say, I don't think we should reduce the child care ratios because that'll hurt children so much. And there will be people who make all sorts of arguments against supply side reforms. And it requires a lot of political nous as well as tenacity to kind of get through the opposition to reform. And at some point you might need to go to an election with a more radical agenda if you wanted to achieve that. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but there would be a decent case to say you actually do need a new mandate at some point.
At some point, yeah, but that's all true, and I certainly agree. But to a certain extent, I think it would not be legitimate, even if technically so, it would not be legitimate, quite rightly, in the eyes of the electorate, if there was a major departure from the mandate that Boris received in 2019. If they started doing policies that are massively counter to that. But I think you can achieve sort of free market policies with that mandate. The mandate was basically to be disruptive and for major reform. It was Boris for change. It wasn't for more of the same. And actually, Boris didn't deliver on his own mandate, other than on Brexit, which, granted, was a large part of it. So I think you could come in, and do make some quite radical changes without not following, what people broadly voted for in 2019, particularly in sort of particularly in the South. I mean, the red wall is a bit more tricky because it's sort of harder to exactly pin down what motivated the vote.
I think I was that's both make incredibly good points. I was more concerned though from an internal party management point of view. I mean, the Conservative Party is a coalition of a large number of different sectional interests, and if a new prime minister comes in, whoever they are, and they haven't laid out a quite specific program that they want to take forward, is there not a concern that they're going to be constantly facing rebellions from either the left or the right, depending on what the policy is? That because they can justifiably say, well, you don't have a mandate to do this because you didn't tell us that this was something that you would want to be doing during the leadership campaign.
Yeah, I think realistically that will be the challenge. Whoever becomes leader is cajoling their colleagues into supporting a series of reform policies, and it's what worries me that the path of least resistance is not to try to do very much, and is try to manage things day to day, and that might make sense, and I think that's effectively what some of the candidates for leader are promising. Now, the risk there, of course, is that you don't get done the policies that you need to do for longer term prosperity. And in a kind of a Thatcherite way, that there might be pain before there's gain as well. If particularly politically and a lot of opposition to reform, if the reform is worth doing, often it's not easy. There's a reason why things haven't been done. There's a reason why we haven't had planning reforms, because it's politically extremely difficult to get through Parliament. There is a lot of opposition to that. So it's those kind of tricky issues that are going to have to be thought about very carefully and developed as policy ideas. And as well as pushing through the blob who might oppose you, and working pretty quickly as well to do so.
Do you think, so I guess moving on to what the new leader's facing, what do you think is the number one, I'll start with you, Ed, the number one issue that in the new Prime Minister's inbox that they'll have to deal with? I mean, Matthew laid out very well the war in Ukraine, cost of living crisis, high tax burden, etc. But what do you think is the absolute number one that the new Prime Minister will need to get to grips with?
I think it's cost of living, because we I kind of feel we're in sort of, to a certain extent, and I fully appreciate that it's already pretty bad for some people, but we're sort of in sort of 2007 territory where we're talking about the impending doom, but it hasn't quite hit yet. Next year is going to be 2008, and it's going to, people are going to really, really feel it. And we're likely to have a recession and various other challenges. And sort of mild, fuel duty cuts that take it back to the price it was 2 days ago, or tinkering like that is not going to suffice. And so, I mean, their absolute immediate challenge, I would say, is coming in and thinking on policies, workable policies that quickly are going to make it easier for working people to weather the storm. They're not going to be able to fix it. It is out of their power, and to a certain extent they are powerless. But unless they are, I think, seen to be doing everything that they reasonably can do, I don't expect that government would last very long.
I mean, you look at some of the numbers on cost of living, and it's, terrifying to see. Was it energy bills double by October? I think grocery inflation's the highest for 15 years or something like that. If you need to refinance your mortgage, the average mortgage, if you're lucky enough to have one, is expected to increase by something like £1,300 a year. I mean, these numbers are honestly terrifying. And if we're just in the foothills, as you say, Ed, that will be really terrifying to a lot of people. Matthew, what do you see? I mean, what would you see as some of the policies that the government could bring in to really fix the cost of living?
Yeah, as I think Ed said, we are at the foothills of a massive challenge, and it's very little that I can see that they can do in the short run. What we hear from a lot of those on the more interventionists on the left side of politics right now is we need to increase people's wages. Well, that's great, but it's potentially just going to push inflation even further into the future and going to make the challenge of getting that down even harsher. all we hear is something about, giving people transfer payments. I think I would love to see, the government cut taxes, and that's going to give people a little bit more money, and maybe payments to some of those who are struggling. Although the government's already announced quite substantial amounts on that front, but that only really changes the distributional impact of the cost of living crisis. The fundamental fact is that as a result of all this inflation, as a result of all these supply side issues, we are a poorer country than we thought we were going to be, and it's very hard to get out of that fact in the short run. Where I think we can start thinking in the kind of short to medium to long term, the economic reforms that are going to make us more prosperous. I'm thinking about the things like removing restrictions on domestic oil and gas production, particularly something like fracking, that could mean we have a little bit more capacity on the supply side of things to have our own gas. And that could help alleviate some of the longer term cost of living issues, something you could do turnaround in maybe 6 to 12 months. I would obviously love to see planning reform to some extent. We've talked a lot previously about things like street votes that are more politically palatable, letting people get together and decide to increase density in their own streets, addressing things like childcare regulations that push up the cost of childcare. The UK has quite interventionist, both in terms of how many carers you need for each child, but also what the level of intensity and tick box checking you expect from childcare educators. We have the early years foundation stage, which is completely disproportionate to what is probably necessary for teaching kids and looking after particularly young kids. So it's those kind of policy areas where I think the government can make a lot of progress. I'd also like to see them not intervene and not do more regulations that could hurt us, things like the football regulator, the digital markets unit, the online safety bill, where the government's seeking to intervene in ways that will be more costly for people and will overall do damage to the size of the economy.
So you're right. You're right on all those issues. I mean, the housing one especially. I think I read somewhere that with 3.5 million housing units behind what we should be if we were at the European average of housing units per capita. And even just to catch up with the EU average, we would need to build 3.5 million homes, and it's difficult to see any government getting that through quickly. But I suppose that just to finish off, I want to get from you both what you think the one big issue is that isn't being talked about. I mean, I know we've kind of dealt with a lot of things already, but is there one specific issue that you think is really important that hasn't been talked about? And what would you think the government should do about it if they wanted to solve it during the next, or at least improve it during the next 2 years before the next election? Ed, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned it previously in this, but I think the government's sort of disastrous monetary policy is, because how much it feeds into all sorts of things, housing, and it is damaging and reckless and outright selfish, basically, to burden future generations with this level of debt and to create the sort of instability that they are doing. And that's a sort of core function of government, and sort of slightly touching on what Matt was saying earlier. They can't even do that right. So rather than trying to regulate football clubs or, tell us, how much of a certain, pudding that we could consume or whatever, I would very much like it if they would stick to things like that, which are their sort of core competencies, and try and get them right.
Matthew?
Yeah, look, I completely agree with everything Ed said. I like to see a little bit more of the kind of long-term thinking about the state of the finances. We have a massive intergenerational inequity issue where we're going to see, particularly as the boomers age, more demands on public in terms of things like social care, healthcare, as well as at the same time a declining working age population, so less of a tax base to pay for all that. We've effectively, arguably, created a bit of a Ponzi scheme where the expectations from people are extraordinarily high, whilst we're not having the kind of level of kids you'd need to ensure that that's fundable and possible to pay for, as well as putting a lot of places to restrict immigration that could potentially help compensate. So I'd like a lot more discussion about those kind of longer term fiscal headwinds that are going to be extremely damaging and disquieting to the ability of the state to provide services, and how we're going to handle that. Are we going to get more efficient? Are we going to have more immigration? Are we going to, in some ways, encourage people to have more kids? Like, what is the solution to this massive issue that could end up lowering all our quality of life over the coming decades.
That's a really good point. I think for me, the big issue that's not being talked about enough is deregulation. I know Liz Truss has mentioned it a little bit, but I'm concerned that we're not getting some real. There's so much regulation. There's so much over-regulation of so many parts of the British economy. It is concerning to me that we don't have every leadership candidate being able to point to at least a few regulations and say, this is what I want to cut. This is how it will improve the economy. And I feel that because we're not having that conversation now, and we're going to fall back into the blob, basically pushing more regulations onto the British economy and British business, because everyone just assumes that regulation is good because it's, think of the children, as it were, why. So I think we need to have a real serious conversation about why regulation is bad, and frankly how you can get rid of a large chunk of it, because also it's a free hit for government, because they get to improve economic activity without actually having to take the hits fiscally that you would get through significant tax cuts. So it seems like a bit of an easy win to me, and so I would like to see a lot more done on that. Just before we go, any final thoughts on the state of the race and where you think the future goes, Matthew?
State of the race. I mean, there will be a new Tory party leader. It will be someone. They will come to power promising a lot to a lot of people, and they will end up, to be a bit of a skeptic about politicians, end up disappointing us to some extent. I think, and I'm going to put on my Australian political hat here for 1 second. You get this sense when you remove a leader that's absolutely necessary, they need to go, and I think there was a strong argument to say Boris needed to go, but at the same time, this will have a seismic ongoing impact in terms of people's perceptions, the way the Tory party handles itself. And there's nothing that inherent about changing leader that means the country will be better off. It is ultimately going to come down to the kind of policies that they pursue and the agenda that they take. And that in itself, not necessarily their charisma, I don't think, but that in itself, in terms of what they are able to achieve, will define their levels of popularity and the country's ability to feel like this was a successful leadership change, or whether or not it was something that was a massive mistake.
Thank you very much. Ed, final word to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Conservative Party is actually in pretty grave danger. Boris was, in my view, sort of last chance saloon for them. Activists and their voters, to a large extent, had, I think, become increasingly tired of being let down by the Conservative Party, which sort of reached a crescendo with Brexit, where they really perceived that they were working against the interests of the majority of the electorate in the country. And Boris, promised to turn all that on his head. Now, he perhaps did not manage to achieve that, but that does not mean that desire has gone away. And if they elect a sort of continuity candidate, I don't think it will bode well for them. So it's I guess pretty vital for their own self-interest that they elect someone that sort of really represents conservatism and what that belief system entails, and a distinct change from the same old that we've sort of seen from the party since they came back into government in 2010.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate you making the time. I know it must have been a heck of a couple of weeks for you both. So I hope you have a great weekend and try and get some sleep. Thank you very much for joining us on this IEA discussion about the Conservative Party leadership race. If you like what you see, or indeed if you see and like any of our other content, then make sure you subscribe to us through YouTube. And if you like it very much indeed and want to see more of it, then support us on the IEA's Patreon page, which you can find through the IEA's YouTube channel or through going to patreon.com. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.